today. Today we're here to talk about something that many teams rely on, but very few really love, access reviews. So for a long time, RBAC has been the go-to way to manage access, but as environments get more complex and responsibilities shift faster than ever, static roles just can't keep up. So in this session, our speakers, Adil and Verinder, will be taking a closer look at why sticking to role-based reviews can actually create blind spots and how moving to a policy-based approach can make access reviews clearer, easier, and much more aligned with how business really works. So by the end of the session, hopefully you'll have a better sense of why policy-based reviews are becoming the new standard. So before we dive in, just a couple of housekeeping items. The session is being recorded for on-demand viewing. And if you do have any questions, which we hope you will have, feel free to pop those in the control panel, and we'll hopefully get to those by the end of the session. So let's dive in. This is the agenda we'll be following today. So we'll be covering everything from the challenges of RBAC, why automate policy-based access reviews, how they work, best practices, and key takeaways. So, Verinder, you want to take it away?
Thanks, Emma. Appreciate that, and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining the session today. And really, this is about as organisations face expanding application landscapes, these domain landscapes, rising regulatory pressure, and an increasingly complex identity ecosystems. These governance teams are under significant strain, and so. This landscape of access control has evolved dramatically over time, and organisations can no longer rely on traditional role-based models to satisfy internal governance requirements or external regulatory scrutiny. Static roles simply cannot express the true dynamic conditions under which modern users and the organisations they work for operate. And therefore, the volume of these identities, applications, and entitlements now exceeds what RBAC was architected to govern. And so we're going to talk about the evolution of that today, right? How we move from static roles to dynamic, context-aware policies that evaluate access continuously, not episodically. Adil?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. I think the modern enterprise needs a more dynamic approach to control risk. And, we're going to talk about AI, which has been the mind of many of our clients and obviously at SafePass internally. And the concept of role has evolved, to say the least, over the last couple of years as AI has shattered a lot of the IT assumptions. And even before that, as companies have moved to cloud, we have seen this need for having more dynamic way of managing access risk, identity security risks. And so, the idea of, outcomes for better governance is critical. How we get there is academic, right? Certainly, we need a lot of audit trails to prove out to the audit that our controls are effective and policies are enforced to ensure there is governance in place. So yeah, I think it's definitely an understatement to say that the companies need a newer approach. I think it's a drastically new way of doing things in 2026 and beyond.
That's fair. It's an approach that's grounded in principles. That policies are a mechanism, not the objective, right? From what you're saying, the objective is governance, right? Yeah, okay, yeah. Measurable, enforceable, and sustainable governance, right? And I know in some minds that can mean two things. Sustainable, people start thinking about, the real-world environment and trees, oil, and pollution and things. And this is sustainable. Controls governance, right? Over your sensitive data and your sensitive systems and controls. And policies are going to be simply the structure through which an organization articulates what safe access looks like and under which conditions it is most de-risked, right? And how deviations should be addressed. Auditors, of course, evaluate governance, not role structures, right? They look for clarity, consistency, traceability, and to your point, Adil, that handful of information that needs to be produced in a consumable format, and a very complex information, right, that needs to be generated and produced in volume, is a new paradigm. It's a new way of thinking, and it's more than just the periodic review windows that need to rely on that type of information.
Absolutely. So I want to share some thoughts with our listeners about, what are the pain points that I hear from our clients in the trenches as I help them, and our teams help them overcome these challenges. And I think we alluded to that somewhat, but in some recent study we've seen and done with our own customers, on average, our customers using 50-some SaaS applications, right, on average, and some are up in the 200 plus ranges, or some are larger enterprises are over 500 and beyond. So that's the reality, right? And so that first point on top left talks about the explosion of identities and identity sprawl. You might read out in the literature on identity governance. As a result, there's lots more access points on the ways how you can enter and access information for your enterprise. And then there's the non-human aspect of identities, which we're going to talk later, right? So this is the number one challenge that is making it very difficult for the CISO organization and audit as well, and compliance and day-to-day business managers to ensure that the risk of fraud, cyber threats, financial misstatements is prevented and controlled and monitored. So in a nutshell, RBAC just falls short, right? Because the whole idea of RBAC, role-based access controls, is that you're assuming, for the most part, quote unquote, that the roles are static. But we know from experience that roles are no longer static, they're dynamic. Organizations are moving too quickly. Their technology is getting updated, their missions are getting advanced, and they're facing new challenges in the markets that are not regional but global in nature. So so that's the number one challenge. And then the systems are getting more complex as we automate more and more of our daily lives at our workplace lives, if you will. Every aspect of work is getting automated, and it's usually handled through those niche applications that are on the edges of your enterprise, right? But they all need to feed into your main enterprise systems that are used to report results ultimately to the market and to your stakeholders, including employees, customers, suppliers, etc. And so that complexity is embedded into this advancement of the digital platform that we have seen adopted over the last 10 years as organizations have moved to the cloud. And cloud is a different world than the traditional world when I started 25 years ago in this industry, where everything was tucked away behind VPNs and firewalls and networks. Today, it's all out in the open, and that's what the modern workforce expects. They want access all the time. We demand productivity gains every year to produce better results and outcomes for our stakeholders. So that's made these systems very complex. On the top of this complexity, as I mentioned, the surface of attack has grown significantly by putting all the information out on the internet. And we're really relying on identities and roles to protect the enterprise. It's no longer the network firewall, right? And so that's the speed of work today. And that's a challenge where RBAC is unable to scale up because it's too dynamic. RBAC by nature is static, right? You sit down and design a role. So I'll give you an example. If you're using an ERP system today that's in the cloud, your roles are getting updated on a quarterly basis when your supplier applies a patch every quarter, right? So they're introducing new functionality, new capabilities. Maybe they've introduced some AI, agents and so forth to help you do your job better. All of that is increasing the number of privileges in your ERP system. And even if you've done custom roles, which is what we recommend, those roles are getting updated because they're inheriting the privileges that roles are built on. So depending on what ERP you're using, it's different technologies, but most ERP vendors, modern ERP vendors, are follow the ANSI standards for RBAC, which enables them to do inherited roles. So those underlying components of your security architecture are getting changes. And we have seen incidents recently where customers that have relied on the role-based traditional identity governance solutions have their data compromised. And we have some podcasts coming up on that as well pretty soon that will highlight that topic. But yeah, so that's where we are seeing that RBAC is just no longer available. So if you've got a identity governance solution that you bought 10, 20 years ago with the assumptions of having an on-prem ERP system where you have complete control over roles, it made sense, but now it's ineffective. And not only you have a threat from the cyber attackers, but you also will have difficulty with your auditors, who are just looking for assurances that you have good controls over how you grant access to identities in your key systems, like the ERP. So the third bullet point on top right is about static roles. So I've emphasized that already in my previous point, but that's basically what static roles are. So static roles are where you will, give a user access to, let's say, do journal entries, right? Because that's part of their job. They work in the finance department and they do journal entries at the period end close process. So now that role itself is going to change as new ways of entering journals comes in. Maybe it's through an AI agent, maybe it's through an API that you're putting journal entries because you have a retail system or some other revenue system. If you're oil and gas, for example, this is where I sit in Texas. Those systems are feeding through APIs into your systems. It doesn't even have to be AI. Maybe you have a ban on AI in your company. There's a lot of traditional companies that are afraid of AI right now. So if you are in a laggard category as a business, you still have to worry about APIs because that's the only way you can communicate between systems. And so those APIs have been given, not just roles that are static roles, but these dynamic roles that are dynamic privileges, I should say, based on API requirements. Somebody in your IT department looked at the API, document from a supplier, published that to a third-party vendor, and they use that to gain access to privileges, but nobody actually checked what can they access. I've seen many cases in our customer dialogues where they have overprivileged access through APIs, and then the APIs have been compromised. A very basic requirement that is creating significant risk, where the static roles are frankly irrelevant to this problem of non-human identities, for example, for APIs. And ultimately, you're paying the price. On the bottom right corner, it talks about error-prone, time-consuming, and incomplete work. And that's where the human factor comes in, where we are wasting companies' limited resources. Instead of making our customers' lives better, our employees more productive, our supply chains more efficient, we are spending time on these mundane and error-prone tasks, essentially, of proving out to our management and our auditors that we have good access controls in place. And it seems like a losing battle in many cases, where you have not been able to make that shift from the static RBAC to a more dynamic approach. So in a nutshell, that's the state of the affairs as we end 2025 with this key webinar. I'd love to have Verinder say a few words on, I know you're talking to a number of our existing clients as well as some new prospects. What are you hearing? Does this resonate with your prospects and customers?
Yes, it does, Adil. Thank you. Yes, it does. At the macro level, there are a couple of systemic reasons as to why a RBAC fails, right? It's an explosion of the applications and identities that have created a combination of access complexity. The business risk is now dynamic. Organizations are very, very fluid. As you highlighted, changes are contextual, process, location, data, behavior, and you cannot encode these types of conditions into roles. And then the modern domain of business applications is a true menagerie, right, of ERP and cloud environments that then introduce this requirement for very detailed minutiae, right, of cross-platform interaction, and therefore complexity that defy then simple role boundaries, right? And so operationally, again, as you highlighted, this produces operational blind spots, right? It opens up the system to error, outdated configurations, which, as we know, have been the theme over this last year, right? With outdated authorities and undocumented processes out of scope, which again is not a good look, have resulted in inconsistent provisioning and incomplete audit evidence, which have resulted in these major breaches for dozens, if not hundreds, of organizations. And they have to invest effort in this area. They have to invest in the right areas. The traditional RBAC maintenance has a huge SOD and investment posture. And while that issue continues to degrade, teams are working harder, but the outcomes are not improving. And that needs to change, as you highlighted.
Gotcha. Okay, so let's take a look at the manual or the role-based access reviews that are happening as part of the identity lifecycle management to govern the enterprise identity today. And what we have heard in 2025 most often, these are the top 4, if you will, right? So the first one is that the risk of missing deadlines, because you're so bogged down with that, understanding and deciphering that static role, which is changing. So in a way, it's dynamic, right? But that's where customers end up having surprises. You're doing your, semi-annual audit or a quarterly audit of your identities, and you find out that, some users have had access to sensitive privileges that they shouldn't have access to. Example, create, supply, or post journals. And now you have to analyze for the auditors before the deadline on what, if anything, occurred during that period where they had overprivileged access. And that's the number one issue why customers miss their audit deadlines, because they just cannot, in a reasonable time, from discovering the problem during a user access review to completing the impact analysis, able to fully justify or explain to the auditors that what risk materialized, what was mitigated through other controls, and so forth. So a typical UAR process, for those of you that may not be extremely close to this process, it requires you to send out surveys to reviewers about controls that they own or the roles they own in many cases, of what a user has been assigned over the last period since the last survey, and are all of those assignments of privileges and roles to that their identity are accurate, right? So, if I am responsible for, let's say, finance, I might have 25 people in finance, and I'm reviewing all of those results, and I will respond accordingly, right? And so that's one way of doing it. There's many other ways, but I'm just keeping it simple for the sake of time. So what we're finding is that, the reviewer in this example will do the review. They'll identify some people. Let's say you had a few contractors in finance to do a year-end close. Year-end has happened, they're gone, but their access hasn't been taken away. Or somebody has switched from finance to procurement, but they still have their procurement, finance responsibilities as well as the new procurement responsibilities. So all of these are, painful lessons. So you've done the right thing. You've removed their access, but the auditor is going to ask you, well, what happened since that last audit? So these people had access to be able to do procurement and do journal entries over the last 6 months. How do we get comfortable that they did not create a liability from their new procurement responsibility and reversed it through a journal entry, which was their old access, often known as the joiner, mover, leaver example, right? And that's the buzzword that we hear a lot. But that's where you're seeing the deadlines getting missed, because the auditors are questioning not only the fact it's no longer a checkbox, right? You can't just say that, oh yeah, sure, we did the review. Here's a report that shows the review. The questions you're getting now are more granular and more impactful to your business, which is, I think, a good thing, because in this day and age of exceeding cyber attacks from outside resources, as well as fraud risks that are surpassed $2 trillion this year, there's a significant pressure on the organization to ensure that these types of identity risks are fully analyzed. So therefore, the auditors are looking after the best interest of the organization. They're asking the right questions, but many of the folks involved in this process in the CISO, CIO organization are unable to satisfy in a timely manner, because a lot of it is manual work. It's hard work, and it's also incomplete work, because you're not looking at it from a dynamic policy perspective and protecting against that policy risk. You're protecting the traditional role, and the role is moving. It's no longer standard. So we end up with that, as that's the number one issue we have heard in 2025. Often the second most issue still, unfortunately, even though we've been preaching segregation of duties, lessons to the market, probably longer than any other company, in my case for 20 some years, there's still, often I see that it's used as a checkbox, an audit checkbox. You'll run the report every 6 months, quarterly, and then you'll say, yep, I'm done. And there's going to be a large number of conflicts. And when the auditors ask you, your management asks you, why do we have people that can create suppliers and pay suppliers? I recently had a discussion with a client where they have many distribution centers around the world, where they're small distribution centers, which is a common case we're seeing in this e-commerce world, right? Where every company today is trying to get to the consumers through a fast, free shipping model. We're all busy with Christmas shopping right now, and I'm one of them. So, I've seen almost all sites that we're shopping at have free returns and free, delivery right now as a consumer, right? And so what does that mean? So this customer is the typical example of a customer in our distribution world, where they have small distribution centers where they can't segregate the duties for shipping and receiving. So they're getting returns, they're getting new merchandise to ship out. Even large e-commerce organizations like Amazon run a very tight ship. So you don't spend a dime more than you need to, because you gotta maximize the profit for the shareholder. So often this is overlooked, where you got the same people with access to shipping and receiving, and that conflict is happening. And as a result, especially during the peak seasons for retail, like the Christmas season, we're seeing, there's a big uptick in fraud. The economy is mixed. Inflation is impacting, and when if you look at this fraud studies and trends, what you find is fraud typically goes up, and the readings I've been doing is showing that trend this year, unfortunately, as the prices of daily needs and necessities have gone up in many regions of the world, including United States, that the fraud is on the uptick. And so there are situations where someone that was overlooked in shipping and receiving, especially in this season, because you wanted to get more product out to the customer through your e-commerce sites, you have lowered the standards where you can process orders faster and you can manage the returns quicker back to your suppliers. You've opened up the gates a few, and you're saying that this is my business constraint. My management wants better customer service. They want faster supply chains. So I'm going to open up that. And that's fine. Look, we're not getting in the way of doing business, but then there needs to be some mitigation on that risk. Again, with the RBAC capability and the traditional identity governance players that are offering are role-based. They don't go down to the fine-grained level of privileges. So you can have a shipping role, a receiving role, and you may have a, let's say, view role, right? But that view role has been updated in a way that now it's also a receiving role. And people are finding those loopholes in complex ERP systems and generating these risks of fraud. And the auditors, in some cases, have caught that. So a big risk especially in this season, is shipping and receiving and segregation of duties. And the solution is that you have to build policies around mitigation. So automatically, when you give someone risk for a business reason, give someone access that creates a higher risk, you also have to consider the other side of the ledger, which is how you're going to mitigate that risk. So what we offer, for example, is the ability to monitor those shipping and receiving transactions in our platform, so that if the same person has shipped and received a product and that's gone to their, let's say, home address, or something that just doesn't seem right, it's happened maybe within a minute or two. So you can come up with all kinds of profiling in our systems, rules logic you can apply. So we can flag that. And maybe it's a good reason why that's happened, but it's also possible that we need to put that transaction on hold till it's verified and prevent fraud from happening, which is a common occurrence, especially this year at this time. So that's a big risk that we have seen materialize in 2025. The third item is, again, kind of along with that previous point around shipping and receiving. You just have too much access. Some organizations that, especially the ones that are in the mid-market, I've seen in 2025 that they have really struggled with excessive privileges because they're trying to get more done with less. And it's not just humans, right? They're doing more integration with their suppliers, with third parties. So they're opening up their supply chain. Things are moving from China to Mexico or whatever the region is, based on tariff wars and so forth. So you're opening up more integration through APIs, and APIs have been given more access than needed to be able to perform transactions. And that's creating a threat between organizations, but also from the insiders, because the insiders have been given access to do more with less, and there is no mitigation provided. So the roles are not clean. Also, another example of roles not being clean is new deployments. We've seen significant uptick in 2025 on cloud deployments of ERP systems. So those deployments typically don't involve hygiene around the roles and responsibilities review, because your cost of deploying an ERP system is significant. And when push comes to shove, where the corners get cut is the role design. And so many times you've gone live with a role, maybe you have a managed service provider that's supporting you, and they need access to the highly privileged role just so they can provide hypercare during the 90-day, 6-month period, depending on your size and scale of the transformation. And they have keys to the kingdom. And so all of these risks are now becoming concerns, and the manual, even the role-based approach, is inefficient and inaccurate and incomplete in getting you the results you want, not only for the audit, but just to manage your business and keep it from turning into a major headline in the Wall Street Journal, right? The fourth element that we have seen this year is that the impact of all the first three items, right? So the security teams are pulling their hair out. They can't keep up, and you've hired all the people. Right now, there's a shortage of cybersecurity people. It's a great career if you want to get into it right now, because there's so much limitation. There's turnover in our custom organizations where the bigger players are poaching the smaller ones and attracting the talent pool that is limited. With the new regulations in the U.S. market, for example, we're seeing even more constraint on the availability of the right level of resources that are available. So you're relying more and more on folks to do IT security that are probably not best suited for that role, and maybe they've come through a rank of traditional IT and they don't understand right now the full elements of, let's say, the NIST framework, right? That is so essential part of the framework to implement, principle of least privilege. And so they're learning on the job, and they're doing their hard work, but it's not smart work, right? So those are some of the top 4 challenges we see with customers that are using role-based access. On top of that, they're trying to solve this problem through a manual process. So that's what I wanted to highlight here, and love to hear your view on this, Verinder, as well.
100%. I couldn't agree more, and I think the audience would agree with what you've laid out there in terms of the control breakdown perspective, and also what that really means in terms of the executive risk perspective, and the detail in the center of that, right, which is the key importance. There are failure modes if you stick by legacy models or heritage models, let's call them that. Your reviews miss deadlines, and this will create audit exposures. Auditors have a set of KPIs to perform to, right? Dashboards are dashboards, but there are real KPIs about how good or how bad things look, or how de-risked I am. And that means that SOD conflicts can remain undetected because reviewers lack context, to your point. There's burdens of work, excessive privileges accumulate due to drift and insufficient challenge, right? You've got to challenge the access, and therefore the entire process places a disproportionate operational load on the organization, that being IT, security, internal audit, and in reality, there are other people involved in this, the interviewers, the reviewers, those that collate the data. It's a large manual effort, right? And it needs collation and proper distribution. And then if you don't get that right, then it's a tsunami wave, right? It rolls upwards to the executive part of the business. These failure modes then create material risk, regulatory findings, misstatements, exposure. The point you made, am I going to be in the Wall Street Journal? Am I going to be an episode of American Greed, right? Narrated by Casey, season 40. At least things happen, right? And so the boards and executives want this continuous assurance as part of their consolidated reporting, right? They want these red flags raised, which is, I urge the audience, if you look at this, look at the Chambers book. You can buy it on the Osaka website or Amazon. that raise the red flag. And manual processes effectively cannot provide that. That is the one thing to say. And therefore, there's this genesis going on at the moment for policy-based reviews.
Gotcha.
So why should somebody make a case for policy-based reviews then?
Shall I start this one?
Go for it.
Yeah. So there are, I think, as we highlighted in the early slide, there are practical things that need to happen. There's a practical shift, right, from a practitioner standpoint, and then there is a conceptual shift. That is, what does the policy-based or the policy actually look like, right? And so, what that needs, therefore, is consulting with the business, right? You've got a plan. You've got to sit down and say, right, what do my new policies now look like, right? What have I been doing? Right, okay, well, this is what my role structure has been today, right? This is what I've been doing. What is my delta, right? Where do I actually need to be, right? And ensure that you've learned lessons from your previous foray into this area, whether working with roles or working with a policy-based system that you're trying to design. It's about consistency across your systems, so naming conventions as much as possible, right? Try to have role libraries, right, across the business that can then be localized. Yeah, that then the glow localization I'm talking about is tax autonomy. Brazil used to be one of those. I mean, every country, every region has its own, and therefore there's always an element of this. But that's contextual awareness, and so you have to then look at it and say, right, I'm going to transform my access reviews. They're going to be not retrospective of activity, but proactive and risk aware. All right. And what that means from the practitioner's point of view then is that they'll be able to look at it and review risk rapidly and repeatedly. And also this reduces the risk surface dramatically, because what you understand is that you have commonality as much as possible, right? You either go through an iterative process, or you understand the complexities of sitting with your users and understanding your applications and how those applications work with your business processes, right? Talk to each other in that respect. And that ensures that you assess for violations, toxic access combinations, and you understand what these targeted exceptions are, right? And you're no longer sifting through thousands or reams and reams of low risk entitlements. Human error then decreases, review cycles accelerate, and the audit trail becomes complete and defensible. So I think that as a rapid case, it's a practical shift and a conceptual shift that is required from both the business and the technical side that's actually deploying the application. Madhu?
Yeah, that's a great overview. I mean, I just want to bring it down to a few examples that we're doing in our client base today. So I'll just put one example in the interest of time, which is, let's say that you have to help you color what it means to do policy-based review, right? Bring it down to just some basic features. So let's talk about roles review. I think we've discussed it in the past, but just to summarize, a role-based review is, like I said earlier, you will send out to the reviewer once every 6 months, every quarter, okay, show me all the users in finance. And then the user, the reviewer says, okay, this person has moved into procurement. They still have their finance privileges. Let's take them away, right? That's the old way of doing things. The modern way, which we're calling at SafePath the policy-based review, is that I will sense when a sensitive privilege has been assigned to an identity. Doesn't matter how it's gone there. So what does that mean? Let's say you have a ERP system and it's integrated into a procurement system. Let's say Coupa is your procurement system, or Ariba or something like that. And then you have Oracle ERP or SAP HANA or something in your as your main platform for ERP, right? So now across these two systems, I'm giving a very basic example. I'm not going to go through 50 systems here that the company typically has, but let's say you've identified a policy that says supplier bank accounts are sensitive access for us, right? That's a sensitive access. We want to be very careful who gets that access. So now a number of ways this problem can occur. Let's say that one of these two vendors have introduced a new feature that somehow made it to production, where now a bunch of people that have a job role of HR suddenly have access to doing supplier bank accounts, because HR was supposed to get access to employee bank accounts to be able to do benefits transfers and so forth, but somehow they also got access to bank accounts for suppliers. A very real example, by the way, that happens on almost on a monthly basis. We hear about these stories at SafePass. So you will not catch that for another 5 months, right? Because let's say you've finished the review, you're doing every 6 months review. So that's the old way, right? You realize how much that risk is. Now, what happens in the new way with SafePass policy-based approach is we will sense that change. We will profile that against the HR elements of the identity versus the application privileges of the identity, and flag that as a risk, and immediately send out to the owner of that risk, which is typically the role owner that's responsible for procurement, right? So there's somebody in the organization that reviews that procurement every 6 months. And this is in real time. It's happening where now you've shrunk that 5 month of exposure down to 5 minutes maybe, right? That's the beauty of this dynamic role-based approach, policy-based approach over the role-based approach, where you have reduced the exposure by 5 months. And I would say, depending on what your fraud losses are in your industry, maybe on an average, tens of thousands of dollars, right? Because that one transaction was misused. It could also be a novice error, just somebody new that has started and they just got granted this access, and they didn't realize that with their HR role they could also change and look at supplier bank accounts and change them. Or someone with an insider threat that we talked about earlier, in fact changes the supplier bank account to their personal bank account or one of their friends' bank's accounts, right? And then quits the job next day. Now there's $1 million check that's going to SAP for the renewal of their software license, goes to this person in a country where you can't recover that, right? So this is a kind of risk that can be practically remediated, mitigated, and most importantly prevented by using policy-based reviews. There's many more examples, but that's one that I wanted to add to render what you explained at the high level.
So to summarize, Verinder?
Sure, yes, I can take this one. So traditional role-based access control defines who can do what, and it's rigid like that, right? It lacks context, and by that I mean, if you look at it in terms of it's a very high-level role, like a generic name AP to GL, for example, or an AP role, and then underneath that you would have a number of sort of functions related to the specific application that you're working with, and these functions would roll up to a certain set of tasks or items, and then you would cluster those together to complete whole functions. And then underneath that you might have special objects which are designed for specific users, some certain customizations, tax flow, things like that, right? And again, that's very rigid, as I said. And then policy driven, of course, defines how, when, and under what conditions, right? And that's really, really important, under what conditions the access is appropriate. And so policies then allow you to incorporate data sensitivity, activity patterns, and data sensitivity. So when you have cross-departmental, cross-country, discounts, applications based on, you know, sub units, right? You know, cascading depending on supplier types, where you're getting certain product or discrete materials from. Again, you know, just by listing out 4 or 5 items there, I've made myself even, you know, looking at it even in an even more complex fashion, right? And so automated controls then allow you to remove this noise and complexity, right? It will detect violations at a level that you need, the access that you're providing, specific to the areas that you're looking at, right? It doesn't need to look at the whole role. If it's a specific object, if it's a specific area or process that you need to get on top of, or a particular toxic combination of processes and privileged escalation, the workflows will ensure that remediation is prompt, documented, and audit ready, right? Strategically then, what that means is that from a product perspective, context sensitive models must align with governance and business reality, i.e. what we've threaded through this presentation, which is organizations are dynamic, they're no longer single-threaded, processes which are sensitive will flow across numerous applications and sub-application domains across your enterprise, and therefore the applications SafePass supports that cloud agility, the complexity of that business environment, which is more than just ERP, and then the regulatory expectations, right, which are forever evolving, and of course the element here, reducing the overall operational overhead and cost of maintaining that compliance, right? Simplifying, automating, and then reducing the overhead associated with that.
Yeah, I think you summed it up really well. I think the only thing I would add that we think beyond, you know, policy-based, I think we've made pretty clear that dynamic policy-driven identity governance or access governance is the way to go, because it does give you a bigger and more dynamic view of your organization's identities and profiles, and really protects your enterprise against the emerging risks, not only from human identities but also non-human identities. I think one thing that we're also working very hard for our customers is to make sure that, because it's a more complex problem and we're solving it more dynamically, that we're really active. You heard me say about active governance in this year a lot, and that's been top of mind for us and our customers, is how do we make this access governance more active, where to the point we made earlier about, you know, the human factor, right? That there's people are bogged down, they can't keep up with it. There's too many identities and too many applications to manage with a limited budget. So it's becoming a problem that simply can't be solved by the traditional approach of periodic reviews. It has to be a proactive view, which is intelligent, AI-driven, and that's where, if you talk to us in 26, you'll find that SafePass is the leader in you know, enabling that capability, with the business goal in mind that we want to make identity governance more active, which means the system does more with less, and so you free up your resources without losing control over your business.
And so what are some of the best practices then? How can organizations make policy-based reviews more effective?
Yeah, I think that these little 4 items, I can expand on that, and then please render your insight is helpful here. So I'll just say that, you know, the very basic is, you know, look at your policies. Like, what do you have in place? Because you have policies. Sometimes they're in a 3-ring binder. It's still in this day and age. Sometimes they're on SharePoint. Sometimes they're in a, you know, some kind of a policy tool, fancy policy tool. But the challenge is they're not integrated into your access governance. That's 90% of the market out there, right? That everybody knows that people creating suppliers shouldn't be paying suppliers. You know, people shouldn't have access to change customer credit limits. So this is all understood by business. It's unfortunately fragmented and it's disconnected from the actual systems. So start by reviewing where you are as you close this year and look at the new year with new goals in mind. And then integrate these policies with the systems where the action is, which is your digital platform. It's the cloud, it's the SaaS applications, your ERP systems, and not to, I know we don't mention it here, but I also go further into, your ITSM systems, ServiceNow, your identity systems like Okta, Azure, ADFS, whatever you're using, legacy or modern, right? So integrate into all that your policies, and that's how you can enforce policies in this day and age, because identity is growing rapidly, right? So there's some studies that are showing that whatever identities we have for users today are going to 10x to 100x when it comes to including employees and non-human identities, right? So for every human, there will be 100 plus non-human identities in the future workplace, which is a huge issue, right? So now is the time to get your house in order before this, to use the word that Virender used earlier about a tsunami, right? The tsunami effect of identity explosion hits your organization. So get that all integrated. Automate the review side. If you're still doing it manually, even if you're a mid-market customer or a small business, it's going to be very difficult to do all that in the future as we have more non-human identities. And then, just the very basic nature of audit trail, make sure you have a centralized reporting system. And so we make all of this possible for you within SafePass. You don't have to think about it, and it's all done for you. And that's the value we can bring to you now and in the future.
So why do organizations move beyond RBAC, Virender?
I think the shift away from role-based access control is driven by necessity. Environments, the domain environments for ERP and the business applications that drive businesses are more dynamic, true disparate applications, right? Distributed applications, multiple servers, cloud, on-prem, web, risks are more nuanced. Regulatory expectations are far more stringent now, right? You start with SOX, NIST, HIPAA, you've got these sub-frameworks. You can't hide now behind the thread that says, well, I don't have to do it because I don't have to comply with SOX, because all the frameworks that you would have been using have been homogenized, right? They've all effectively pointed you in the same direction. And so to that point, policy-based access reviews provide real-time insight, automation and continuous enforcement, right? And as we've highlighted, you can pull on that thread through the presentation, these standard static role-based access control capabilities just do not deliver that. And organizations modernize, right? And part of that modernization, which generally is led by another function, let me be fair, unless, if you've had a breach, then yes, there's a big difference, right? Or if you're completing a specific project to address this area and mature in this area. But generally what you'll be doing is you might be deploying or expanding into a new region, expanding into new capabilities with your business systems. And it's a digital transformation. At that point, you want stronger compliance, reduce risk exposure, and significantly lower review overhead, right? A good example is organizations expanding into Asia, which, well, we know, right? We all read the news. That shows us what's going on, right? Like the fraud, these mass sweatshops over the place and the likes, and you want to be protected. You want to protect the business against that. So forward-thinking organisations then realise that they've done their pestled analysis, right? They've looked at the dynamics that they're going into, and that they realise that governance must evolve with their technology and operations and their overall goals, i.e., policy is the future of access controls.
Okay, well, in the interest of time, what are some of the key takeaways that our audience can, use to go back to their own organizations and start these discussions about policy-based access reviews?
Bill, do you want to give it 30 seconds or shall I go first?
Yeah, I can talk for a few seconds. I know we're coming to the end of the session. So I think just to summarize from my view, very briefly, is you can read this yourself, but basically, as you think about 2026, and you are burdened with this problem of identity lifecycle management, cybersecurity, risk management, and so forth, start by looking where you are today, baseline your challenge, where you are today. Reach out to us if we can be of value, and we have lots of experience, hundreds of years experience between our management team on doing this work. So be glad to make our resources available to you to help you kind of benchmark your baseline against the market, maybe even your industry, right? Industries are different, finance versus retail versus or oil and gas, right? So we could do that. And then, once you baseline it, you can not only look at the gaps you have, but also the impact of that gap on your business. So, to use that cliche, low-hanging fruit, right? So where is the low-hanging fruit specifically for you as you open up the new year? Maybe there's a big AI initiative. Maybe there's lots of APIs, non-human identities that you're worried about. So we can then pinpoint and really adapt our solutions to those specific needs and not boil the ocean, right? I know that some of the players in our industry have a very, very long deployment cycle, which scares off the buyers. And so we don't take that approach. We really want to focus on a strategic, pinpoint approach to solving your problems, but also giving you the roadmap for the future. So a highly scalable, adaptable approach where we can help you.
That's it. That's precisely the point.
Okay.
So policy-based access reviews are becoming the new standard, right? That then continuous enforcement is the differentiator, and the outcomes become measurable with consistent reporting improvements. Yep.
Absolutely. Well, a big thank you to both Verinder and Adil for sharing your insight today. So basically, as we wrap up, the big picture is more than clear. I think that traditional role-based RBAC just isn't enough anymore for complex, fast-changing environments. So policy-based reviews offer a smarter alternative, giving real-time insights that reflect how your business is operating day to day. So thank you for joining us today. We hope the session gives you a clear path towards a more modern policy-driven access governance. And if you're ready to take the next step, then we're here to help. So thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.